I begin by talking about visioning at end of life because that is where most of us, if we're going to experience a loved one, and have a window view of what they are experiencing as they're nearing death, oftentimes that's the closest we get until it's our time. And so many, if not all, of us vision at the end of life. And so sometimes it comes months and then ebbs and flows. Sometimes it comes in the last hours, the last days. But to a person, that's a part of our letting go of this physical life. And yet, rarely do we talk about it. And when our loved ones speak of it, oftentimes you think, oh, it's the medication. Oh my gosh, something's wrong. Rather than seeing it as a normal process. And a lot of times our loved ones don't say anything about what they're seeing because they are afraid of being judged or being thought, oh, I'm losing my mind. So, and yet, when we normalize this as part of our conversation with friends and loved ones at end of life, it increases a sense of hope, of meaning, of connection, both personal. It's a very powerful moment to share with somebody, and a person after person is reassured when their loved one shares something like that. So I encourage you to suspend judgment as we talk about different experiences. So I want to compare and contrast visioning versus a hallucination. So yeah, there are both. But visioning usually is a very pleasant experience for the person, whereas a hallucination is typically something that's disturbing and frightening. And then in a vision, you typically see people that either angels or Jesus or Mary or somebody that has gone before you in your family. Typically, those are the people that you see. And it's significant why that person would be coming at this time to be with you and support you. Whereas in hallucinations, typically they're not people, and if they are, they're after you, and they're aggressive, or they're scary. And hallucinations are typically brought on by the side effects of medication or by the disease itself. And then, and also insects and different types of fire and frightening figures are most common in hallucinations. And the other thing is, when people are visioning, they often don't have words for what's happening. So they'll use symbolic language. And that, and it's fascinating, and it's often travel language. It's like, I'm ready to go, or I don't know where my ticket is. I've got to find my ticket. Or the coach hasn't arrived yet. And one lady that I worked with, she would say, I keep waiting for that sleigh to pull up. And a young man that I worked with, who was Down syndrome, he kept seeing a horse in the distance. And he kept saying, whenever the horse gets here, I'm going to ride to be with God. And so, and in that case, his father was like, there is no horse there. We're in the living room. There's no horse. And it was really hard to get his dad to stop saying that, because for that young man, that horse was visible in there. And when one day when he said, oh, the horse is here, the dad finally got it. And it was that day that the young man died. So again, barriers to communications about end of life, fear of ridicule and judgment, being seen as abnormal, and not a part of our everyday culture. We don't talk about life, death, and afterlife. We avoid it. So a little bit about my background that some of you may know and most of you probably don't. That when I was 5 years old, I was born with very severe jaundice. Wasn't expected to make it. They were looking at doing a total blood transfusion. I was very sickly when I was young, and in and out of the hospital for many years, and then with severe asthma. And when I was 5, we were on our way to the Jersey coast down to Cape May, and we went there for 2 weeks every summer. And my parents would pile all the kids in the back of the Cadillac, and we all slept overnight because my dad drove all night long. So we went to I was not well, and we went to both of the doctors, my allergist and the regular doctor, the day before, got some antibiotics. And the doctor said, don't give them to him until you get down there. He'll get nauseated in the car. So we get down to Cape May early in the morning, and my mom gives me the antibiotic. And not long after there, all of a sudden I can't breathe. And so they think it's an asthma attack. So they treat me initially as I'm having an asthma attack, and then they realize nothing's helping. And then my dad's best friend, Mr. Doman, he goes, they're all panicking and they've called 911. And so he grabbed me by my feet, and hung me over the hotel's railing, shaking me, trying to get me to breathe, because I was no longer breathing. And so then the ambulance gets there, they put me in the ambulance, and I cardiac arrested. And in that experience, keep in mind I'm a 5-year-old kid, and I immediately was watching the paramedics giving me CPR, and from above. And then from there, the ambulance kept going, and I wasn't going with them. They're driving down the road, and now I'm looking at the ambulance driving down the road. And then I get further and further away from them, and I turn, and there is that classic way that people talk, a tunnel of light. And I remember going through that. And when I got to the other side of that tunnel, I was met by angels, I was met by people, I met my grandparents who I'd never met. And I immediately started interacting with people there. And in hindsight, I was no longer a little boy. I was in adult size, like everybody else, and everybody looked about the same age, just very youthful and healthy and strong. And I remembered sitting under a tree in cycles of time and being taught. We would sit in a circle under a tree, and then I would walk off into the countryside and sit down under a special tree that I loved, and I would just ponder what has been spoken. And then they would say, well, it's time for you to go back. And I would say, no, I'm not going back. And then it would be this whole cycle again, where I would sit under the tree, we would listen to people speak, and I met, and in this experience, I knew who Jesus was, and God was at the center of everything as a bright light. There was not a person that I saw, just the bright light in the center of this gorgeous landscape. And everybody and all the trees and all the rocks, everything that was there glowed from within, so that everything was luminous, and colors were brilliant. And if you've ever seen a painting by Parrish, or Google one and look at his work, as I grew up and looked at his artwork, I'm like, he's been there. Because it's this sense where the light doesn't reflect off of you, it is in you. And everything is just so brilliant and beautiful. So finally, after what felt like months to me, in all honesty, and I thought I was there for months, they finally used the mom card. And that day they said, you need to go back. And again, I said, no, I'm not going back. And they said, well, your mom hasn't left your side and she needs you. And so I said, okay, I'll go back. And when I woke up, I was in the hospital bed, and the first thing I said to my mother was, I came back for you. And obviously I'm here. And I will say, yes, I did have moments of my teen years where I was a little issue, and I remember if I was really angry at my mom, I would say to her, don't forget I came back for you. So, because as a child, I did want to be with my mom and my family. But at the same time, that place called me. And yet I also knew that I was meant to stay. So, and a part of that staying meant that I had that experience. I often was able to see spirit then after that. I could see, like looking at a person, I would be able to see when they were going to die. And I often saw people coming and going, like my grandparents, coming and going in our house. And I would be able to understand what they were telling me, even though it wasn't necessarily words, but I would know what they were telling me. And as a kid, I thought it was a curse. I'll be honest. It was scary at times as a kid, because you would know something and then the person would die, and what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I able to stop that? And so throughout my life, that ability has come and gone. But especially through my years in hospice, it was present in my life almost daily. And that's where some of what I'll talk about has come from. But again and again, it just has reaffirmed my sense that we never have to fear death. Because our body dies, but our soul never experiences death. I never experienced death because I never stopped living. And that's the reassurance I have, that I've never been worried after that. And then after starting at hospice, I went to a conference, and there was a person teaching healing touch at one of the conferences. Healing touch is a form of energy work. And energy work is done in pretty much every indigenous culture in the world. And really was unlearned with Western advancement and philosophy and all of this kind of said, oh, that's not real, that's hoo-hoo. And yet I went to this class and I heard, I'd been wanting to learn more about energy work. And that particular speaker at the end of the class said, now, anything that I've just talked about or explained, if it rings true to you, take it with you. If it doesn't, let it go. And immediately I was like, okay, I can study with this group. Because they didn't come in saying, we have all the answers and everything's, we've got the knowledge. So I did study with them, and immediately it gave me a language to put my visioning experience in place. And it also helped me to understand why I was getting information when I looked at people, and it was intuitive and not something physically written on them, and yet I knew things. So it helped structure my life and give me a language that normalized my life a little better. So when we talk about the soul is that part of ourselves that God created and that exists before we ever are born into the physical world. We already exist. Our soul is already with God. And then when it's our time to enter this journey in the body, then we become embodied in the physical. And the physical, the energy body, the layers of the energy field and everything, is basically the organ that allows our soul to be in relationship with the physical body throughout our life. And so that relationship between our soul and our physical body then enables us to then live into the world. And yet, as you would think, our mind, which is the organ that really controls the body, and then our physical self becomes like a layer that the soul has to experience life through. So that's why we're not perfect, even though our soul is. And that when we talk about a person's spirit, the soul and the spirit are not the same thing. The soul is the true self that is eternal, that never dies, and moves on beyond the death of this body, whereas the spirit is really that intersection between physical life and spiritual and soul life. And so our spirit, we're flawed because we can't express our true full self into this existence. And that's sin, and that's brokenness, and that's mortality. The body is mortal, whereas the soul is immortal. And so within the spirit aspect of our being, we have our reason, our affection, our consciousness, our memory, our imagination, our intuition. All those things are in between that reality. And then we have the physical body, which we're all very familiar with, the aches and the pains, the joys and the sorrows. And that's where we have all the five senses, And whereas spirit maintains more senses than the body, and soul ultimately has way more senses than either spirit or body. So like as soon as we exit our body, our soul exits our body, we are in touch with all existence. And there is no fear, no pain, no anxiety, no stress, just peace and harmony. Because outside of the body, we enter into God's perfect realm. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts about what I'm presenting to you as the balance of the soul and the spirit and the body? Okay. So in the Hebrew tradition of the soul, there are 5 levels or aspects. So the nephesh, the soul, and the soul as the engine of physical life. And then ruach, which is my license plate, is spirit. And the word ruach means wind, breath, or spirit, depending on how you use it. But in this case, we're using it as spirit. And that's the emotional self, the personality. And in that circle, soul was at center, spirit was around that. And the neshama, which is the very breath of life, what God breathes into us as we exit the womb, is your nefesh, neshama, and it also represents our intellectual self. And then shayeh, life itself, the super-rational self, and the seat of our will, our desire, our commitment and faith. And then yechidah, the singularity, which is the essence of unity with its source, our essence of God. And then different indigenous cultures talk about the 2 souls or natures within each human being, the animal nature or soul and the godly nature or soul. And so the animal nature of ourself, which is tied to ego and self-preservation, and self-enhancement, physical needs, self-focused. We're really, especially in our culture, we're really good at that part of ourself. And that's really that exists in the area of the spirit. It's not really representative of our true soul. And then the godly soul, driven by the desire to reconnect with its source, spiritual aspirations, altruism, that is what that true essence of ourself is able to come forward. In Judeo-Christian views of reunion with God, so fundamentalists and very conservative evangelicals, they believe that when the body dies, that the soul then just goes into a stasis, like a hibernation, and is in a sleep state until the resurrection. So they do not believe in anything that I've just shared with you. And they believe that only when the Messiah comes will the souls wake up again. And they do believe in immortality, whereas mainline Christians, the soul unites with God or loved ones upon the death of the body and envisioning prior to that. And there are variations on all of the souls being reunited and or only some of them, depending on your Christian tradition. And so heaven is believed by all Christians, whereas not all Christians believe in an eternal hell. That, and those of us that don't believe in eternal hell believe that it's a temporal reality tied to this existence, and that once free of the body, we're free of hell, if that's a part of our reality. But all Christians believe in immortality of the soul. From Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. In 2 Corinthians, Jesus replied, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. So there's that sense of the pre-knowing and that sense of not someday, not far off, this very day, when your body dies, you are with me in paradise. So Islamic texts from the Quran, he gives life and causes death, and to him you shall be brought back. And also, every soul must taste death, then to us you shall be brought back. In Buddhism, they have the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and in Hinduism, the Brihadaranyaka, the Upanishad is what I can say correctly. But both of these texts deal with ensoulment and the journey of the soul. So release of the soul, whenever a person dies, the soul actually leaves from the crown of the head, because that is actually how we enter the body in our mother's womb. We enter through her crown of her head, travel through her body, and then when the fetus is ready, we enter the crown of the head of the fetus to be ensouled. And then when the body dies, we then are released that way again. So I want to tell you some stories of experiences with patients at hospice at end of life. And this first story was about a woman in her 50s, and she came to the cancer center. At this point, I was working a joint program between Hospice of the Western Reserve and Ireland Cancer Center. And I would see all the patients that were newly diagnosed with lung cancer. And a majority of the people diagnosed with lung cancer are typically end stage. It's rare, and now we're catching much more sooner and treating better. But when I was working with the cancer center, still a majority weren't caught until they were metastatic. And she was actually widely metastatic already and had a lot of physical pain from bone metastases and other metastases through her body. And she was from Shaker and very eccentric woman. And when I came in and introduced myself and I said, hi, I'm spiritual care, And she said, you can just turn around and be on your way. I do not need spiritual care. And I was like, well, whoa, I'm not here to judge. I'm here to support you. And she was like, I'll see you. And so I left. And then the next time she came in for treatment, I came to the doorway and I walked in and I said, I just wanted to tell you I'm here. And I heard you were having a hard time with your symptom management from your chemo, and your pain management hasn't been under control. And she goes, yeah, I'm miserable. You can go. And I said, well, are you familiar with energy work? And she goes, yeah. I've had Reiki, I've had, that done, and it's been helpful. And I said, well, I'm not a Reiki person, but I do healing touch. Is it all right if I offer that to you? And she goes, that would be fine, but I don't want to hear any religious crap. So I did energy work with her, and she was able to calm and rest, and she wanted me there every treatment thereafter. And so after quite a while of doing energy work with her when she was in her treatments and helping her to release the pain and helping her to not be nauseated from the chemotherapy, we had this pattern where at the end of the session, because when I do a full energy cycle with somebody, I'm not talking, I'm silent, and she liked that. So at the end of the session though, I would say to her, did any thoughts come up, any feelings, any visual experiences? And then she would tell me vividly what her experiences were when there were certain colors present when I was doing the work, or she would feel something taken, move away from her, out of her, and then she'd feel relief. And she was very descriptive, and so I learned a lot with her. And then one day, I'm in the midst of the session, and my hands are over her, and all of a sudden, I sense movement at my side, and I glance down, and energetically, I see two children standing there, a boy and a girl. And they're standing there just lovingly looking at this woman on the table. And so I was aware of them. They weren't acknowledging me. I just felt their presence the whole time and saw them standing there. And then I got done with the session, and I couldn't wait to ask her, did you have any experience in today? And she tells me it, and then she got this kind of pondersome look on her face, and then just kind of shook her head. And I said, what else did you see? And she goes, well, a boy and a girl. And I go, oh. I said, I'm glad that you shared that with me. What can you tell me about them? And she went, well, and I could see all of a sudden the wall go up. And she said, well, intellectually, as we look at it was a boy and a girl, so obviously it's something about my inner child and the male and female aspects of my life. And she pontificated for a moment and then sent me on my way. I knew darn well that little boy and that little girl had nothing to do with her inner child and her male and female sides of her being. So in the very next session, there are the children again. Get to the end of the session, and she said, well, the kids are back. And I said, so are you dealing with your inner child? And she just looked at me like, you idiot. And she goes, I know they're not my inner child. They're not me. And I said, okay, but can you tell me who they might be? And she goes, they're my kids. And I said, tell me more about that. And she said, well, after college, I worked in DC, did clerkships and things, and I got pregnant, not just once, twice, and had an abortion both times. And she said, those are my children. And I said, and what does their presence here tell you? And she goes, it confounds me. And I go, why? She goes, because they love me. And I said, what else would you expect? And she goes, I gave them up. And she goes, but they love me nonetheless. And she named them. She began to acknowledge them and allow them to be now a part of her life that she had held off at arm's length all this time. And only one other person had known that she had had those abortions, and that was her roommate. And so in the weeks ahead, as she went through her treatment, she was able to get some relief and then very quickly rebounded. And it wasn't, after so many months, she did succumb to the cancer, and I was able to be with her through hospice. And then when she died, she had asked that I would do her funeral. And we actually had her funeral at Plymouth Church in Shaker. But her tenacity and the loving presence of that children, I carry with me always. And I'll leave it at that. And then atheists. I worked with many atheists in hospice. And again, they were like, I don't need spiritual care. And I would be like, well, I'm not here to proselytize. I'm here to support you on your path, whatever that means. And inevitably, most of them allowed me to journey with them. But to a T, they would say, you haven't convinced me about anything. And I said, did I try? And they're like, well, no, but whenever I close my eyes on that day, that'll be it. My family carry my memory on, again and again. I'm like, okay, if that works for you, I'm okay with that. And so, but again and again, one after another, they would come back spiritually afterwards, envisioning, and would thank me for giving them peace, for not judging them, and for giving them that space. And again, it taught me not to judge people and not to make assumptions, but to trust the Spirit of God is working as God wills in and through those people. One gentleman that I have to talk about real quick. He was a Fortune 500, corporate guy, and incredibly wealthy, incredibly connected, and atheist. But so I went out for my one visit at their house, and he sat me down. He sat right in front of me, chair to chair, which was unusual, and his wife sat way on the other end of a couch in a living room, the big living room, and he interviewed me on our first visit. He's like, so tell me about your college. What was your degree? What did you study? Tell me about seminary. What did you study? And he grilled me for an hour. That's not normal. Not in any of my other experiences. And then at the end of that hour, he like I was getting a job interview, he said, well, thank you very much, you can go. And I'm like getting ready to stand up, and then his wife goes, well, honey, didn't you have one more question for him? And he goes, oh, that's right. You said you can connect us with different volunteers and things. Would you connect us with somebody that's had a near-death experience? I would like to hear about their near-death experience. And I just paused, and he goes, wait, you've had one? And I said, yes, I have. But I don't normally talk about it with patients and families. And he goes, well, why else are you here? He goes, sit back down. And so I sit down and I share my near-death experience with him. And he's like, Very good. Thank you for sharing that. Exactly what we were looking for, we wanted to hear. Now we need to discuss this more about what we have just heard from you. And you can come, and he gives me the day and time of the next week. And I go, oh, I'm sorry, it'll need to be in 3 weeks. I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks starting tomorrow. And he goes, I hope you understand that's very disappointing. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry I've disappointed you, but I won't be here. I'm going to be far across the country. And he's like, well, I guess we have to live within those confines. I will see you at such and such a time on this date when you return. And so I left. I'm a week into my vacation, sleeping soundly when somebody bumps the side of my bed. And I open my eyes, startled, and here he is standing at the side of my bed, spiritly. And I'm looking at him, and he goes, Stephen, you can go back to sleep in a minute, but I need you to call my wife as soon as you get home and give her a message. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, tell my wife that it's everything we talked about or could hope for and more. And then gone. And I'm like, really? And I fell back asleep after a little while, after I thought about him intruding on my vacation. And when I got back, I walk into the office, I sit down at my desk, the phone rings, Stephen, you have a call, pick up the phone. It was his wife. I didn't even have a chance to call her. She was the first call that morning, and she goes, Stephen, do you have a message for me? And I said, well, yes. What is it? And so I just said to her, he wanted you to know that it was everything that you talked about and hoped for and more. She goes, thank you, Stephen. I needed to hear that. Bye. Click. No, with all my other experiences throughout my life, nobody has been that controlling in life or afterlife. So I needed to share him with you, because he came and went from my life since then, and for purposeful reasons with other people in his life and things, and it's been interesting. But he blew me away that they made that commitment while I was away that if at all possible, he would tell me a message to give her. And it happened. So then the next person I wanted to talk about, and I call it, is there forgiveness? Because this woman, it was I will say the most dramatic experience I've had working with a hospice patient. This woman had just recently gotten out of prison after 20 years of being in prison. And she had pancreatic cancer, very advanced, a lot of pain from metastatic disease. And she was in prison for 20 years for murdering her husband. And so when I went to meet her, she was quite the opposite of many people when I first meet them. She couldn't wait for me to sit down and for her to tell me her life story and to talk about things. And, and she was very upbeat, and then she would get done talking and she'd say, well, I hope you're going to come see me tomorrow. And I'm like, sure, I will. And so day after day, she's telling me all these stories about her life, and I mean, it's all upbeat. And never bitterness, never anything at first. And then we were talking one day, and she goes, well, Stephen, I can't have a visit today. I haven't slept in days now. I am miserable. My pain is so out of control, and I can't even talk to you right now. And I said, well, I would also offer doing energy work, because that can help with sleep and with pain management. And she goes, well, have at it. I doubt it's going to work, but go for it. So I did an energy session with her, and before it was over, she was sound asleep. And I just tiptoed back out of the room, came back the next day, And she goes, that was incredible. She goes, that's the best sleep I've had in weeks, and the pain was better. And she goes, I don't need to talk to you today. Just give me energy work. So I did the energy work again, tiptoed out after she fell asleep, came back in, and as I walk in the room, she has this hateful, angry look on her face. You! And I'm like, yes? And she goes, we need to talk. She goes, you lied to me. And I said, wait a minute, when did I lie? And she goes, you didn't tell me that I was going to have to deal with emotions and memories and things. And I'm like, well, that's a natural part of energy work and letting go and preparing yourself. And she goes, yeah, but you didn't give me that information, and so I have had to deal with my emotions. And she goes, and I am so angry at you. And I go, so you don't want me to do energy work anymore? And she goes, no, I'm going to prove something to you. It was just an anomaly. Your energy work didn't do crap. She goes, you just watch. Go ahead and do something. You see I won't even fall asleep. And so I went to go do the energy work, and it was like putting my hands against a wall. I was like, okay. I went through the motions, nothing happened. She glared at me the whole time, and she dismissed me and said I was never to come back. So a couple weeks go on, she is getting worse, declining more. Her pain is raging out of control. And so I would come to the door and make eye contact, and she would give me the look like, just try and walk in this room. I'd walk away, and so another week goes by. She is just an excruciating, screaming out. She's in so much pain. And the social worker comes in. She goes, Stephen, I don't care that you don't want to violate her telling you you're not allowed to be in there, but you need to get in there and you need to fix this. You need to give her energy work and stop this cycle of pain. And I'm like, nope, I can't. I said, she will bar me one way or another. I said, at the very best, I'll come to the door, I'll make eye contact. If I'm received into the room, I will go in. Otherwise, no. So I come to the door, I make eye contact, and she's just staring at me, not glaring at me. And I gestured like this, and she goes, and so she let me come in, and I sat, and she looked at a chair beside her bed, and I sat down in the chair. And then as I focused myself, I saw what her reality was, which really was hell. That there was this visual image of a deserted landscape. She was chained to a rock in this landscape. Wind was raking everything, and there was no sun to be seen. It was just clouds racing over her, and there were 3 figures standing on the side of the bed, watching her. And she was glaring at them and angry, and I put my hands up at first, and she went. And she just stayed in that cycle, and I just stayed to witness it. And then after a while, her attention went to the door, and the door spiritually opened. There wasn't physical door opening. And a man and a small boy entered the door. And she glared at them, and you could see that the man was gesturing to her, and she kept saying, no, no. And then she'd go back to just shaking and angry. And so that happened a couple times in a row. No, no. And then finally, she looked at me, and I held eye contact, and I went like this, and she went like this. And so I started doing energy work. And as I did the energy work with her and prayed over her, slowly she relaxed. She was no longer holding the chain above her. She was no longer rigid and angry and yelling, and she just kind of relaxed back into the bed, though I still could see her chained to a rock. And these people have never moved. They're just standing there watching her. And all of a sudden the door opens again. The man and the young child enter, and she looks at them and she says, "Yes." And the little boy ran to the bedside, and the gentleman entered all the way into the room. And immediately the rock was gone. She wasn't chained to the rock anymore. There was a gorgeous sun and blue sky, and the three that were standing here turned around and left, and she just relaxed into the embrace of that little child. And within a few hours, her symptoms were managed, and she died with that afternoon. But that was, it was the most dramatic and exhausting experience that I had ever had with an individual in that way. But again, there was that sense she was already in hell. And then later that day, right before she died, her son, and I didn't mention them, the son and the daughter were the physical son and the daughter, and this backstory will explain to you why she was in prison. And that was, she had a son and a daughter and the daughter was in the crib, the son was only 2 years old, and her husband, one day she came home from work, and her husband was molesting the baby in the crib. And she called the police took the information, and granted this was decades ago that this took place, and they did not arrest the man, and so she was very angry that they didn't arrest him, and she swore to him, "If you ever touch our daughter again, I will kill you." And she came home another day, weeks later, he was molesting the daughter again, she killed him. And she was then put in prison for that reason. So this infant girl and this 2-year-old boy are now 20 years later when she gets out of prison. And her family kept them from her while she was in prison. So she came out of prison pretty bitter and no relationship with these kids. And they were kind of satellite figures during her time with hospice, and only near the end did they even come or go from the room. They blamed her. The family had really convinced them that it was in her imagination and that she killed him for no reason. But what was beautiful about that was, right before she died, her son entered the patio door where that spiritual door kept opening and closing. He walked to her bedside just shortly before she took her last breath. And was there reconciliation between all of them? No, not here. But I trust that on those kids' deathbeds, that there will be reconciliation. Because that's the one thing I see again and again with people. If you don't do your reconciliation now, you're going to do it on the deathbed. That's a promise. It may feel like a curse, but it's a promise. Because she hardened her heart so much that it wasn't until she was dying that she could forgive. And then she finally did. So affirmation and gratitude, a lot of the times people come back to us, they really are affirming our life. People come and go from our life every day throughout our entire life. And typically we're not even conscious of them being there. And yet there are moments, I think for most of us, where we're like, all of a sudden you're just thinking about grandpa, or you're just thinking about so-and-so, and it's like they're there again. And I'll reassure you, yeah, they are, because our intuition often picks up on them being there with us. And oftentimes people will say, I felt something on my shoulder, or I felt like somebody just walked in the room. And when somebody physically walks into a room and you didn't hear or see them, how often we feel that in our being, because energetically, when our energy enters the room, we change the room. And so a lot of times you feel somebody enter the room without hearing them, and that's true with spirit too. We often intuit their presence and then rationalize that, nah, nobody's there. But they again and again, this is actually my dad's parents, or actually my great-grandparents, my dad's grandma and grandpa. And those are the two of the people I met when I had my near-death experience as a child. And I was able to tell my dad all about them, and yet they were long gone before I was born. And but again, there's that sense of just gratitude. You immediately are filled with gratitude when free of this body. The Hamsa, which, how many have seen this symbol before? Okay. This is called a Hamsa, and in many of Eastern cultures, it's a very common image. Many men and women will wear them on their body, or they'll have them in their houses on walls. And a lot of times there's literally an image of a human-looking eye in the center of the palm. And I'd seen these and been drawn to these ever since I was a kid. I was always fascinated with the Hamsa. And in Eastern cultures, Jewish, Muslim, and others, it's called the hand of God, or sometimes it's called the eye of God. And it wards off evil spirits, is what it is used for. And it's meant to bring peace to your home, because evil and negativity can't come in when you use that icon, that symbol. So I was always fascinated, and I do have Hamsas. I have an Israeli Hamsa up in my office. And so one day when I was singing at the synagogue, and in worship and when I sung at the synagogue, it was the 28th High Holy Days that I've sung for this past year. And in worship throughout my life, that has been one place that visioning has occurred again and again and again, that I've seen spiritual realities in the midst of worship. And when I was at synagogue this one time, it was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and I was, singing throughout the day the sacred music of forgiveness and of asking for forgiveness. And we were in the midst of having silent prayer time, where you're praying about your relationship with those that have gone before us, praying for healing in those relationships where there was brokenness. And so I was praying for my dad, praying for, other members of my friends and families, and so and all of a sudden I had this sense that somebody was standing right in front of me, and I thought one of my choir members had flipped around and was standing face to face, and so I opened my eyes, and it was my brother. And my brother had been deceased for a few years now, and I'm looking at Walter, eye to eye, and granted I was a little taller than he was, but so we're looking eye to eye, and he doesn't say anything to me, and he just makes this very loving eye contact, and then he held out his hand in front of him like I'm doing now. And then he gestured to me, and for me to hold my hand and meet his. So, Mary Jane, would you stand up? So if you hold your hand up like this, and then I place my hand here, what do you see? Yeah.
Oh, am I supposed to be looking at your hand or?
The hand,
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
What do you see there?
Well, I see my fingernail polish.
Well,
And
do you see the shape that we're creating?
Oh.
Look on the,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like this. Like,
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like the hamster.
And so, and he just smiled whenever I realized, because he pushed my hand around and created this image, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, it's a hamsa.
Yeah.
And I immediately realized what he was telling me was that the real meaning behind this is that physical life and life thereafter is ever connected, and not to, and that there is that sacred bond. And so then after that, the Hamsa has had even deeper meaning to me, not just as a symbol, that protects us, but it's that knowledge to me that protects all the more. That knowledge that in life and in life after, we are ever connected. And as long as we have that knowledge and that faith, we can live each day without fear and without dread. So before conception, we already exist as who we are. Our soul is in God's presence and uniquely who we are. And I chose this symbol, this is a galaxy, because the spiral, which you see in the sand whenever you place your candles in the sand, the spiral or the labyrinth, a labyrinth is nothing more than an elaborate spiral. If you think about it, it is in everything. It's a ubiquitous symbol and design. Our DNA, a spiral. You look at a shell, you cut it in half, you get those beautiful spirals. There is, again and again, spirals are all through. It's part of sacred geometry. And so we look at the galaxies, and again we see these spiral images. And when I'm doing energy work, and when I've done energy work with people, I would see every once in a while a spiral in a woman's energy field. And at first I didn't understand what that was. And then over time, as I worked with different people, and as I particularly worked with one of my colleagues who had difficult pregnancy and difficult becoming pregnant, one day I'm looking at her and I see a spiral here in her energy field. And I just thought, oh, that's curious. And then I kept watching it, and it would, next time I saw her, it was moving down, moving down, moving down. And all of a sudden I looked at her and I'm like, she's pregnant. And I was like, how are you doing? Anything new? No. And so finally she admits to me, days later, she goes, Stephen, I did want to share with you I'm pregnant, but I'm really afraid because I've lost all the other pregnancies. And I was like, well, what can I do to support you through this? And she goes, I need you to do energy work for me, because if anything, I trust that'll help me hold this child. And so that spiral and that little fetus don't connect immediately. The fetus develops and grows, and the spiral's there, and the spiral waits and waits and waits until the right time to then enter or ensoul. So ensoulment is that mechanism, that way that the pre-existent soul actually then merges with the body. And it's not at conception. Like a lot of times people think that it's at conception. And in all honesty, I've seen the spiral in women, and they haven't conceived yet. The spiral's already there, waiting for the conception. And I've seen where women are not able to conceive, and then the spiral leaves. And so my sense is that it either comes back when it's able to be embodied or moves on through its cycle of life that way. So in Christian, all of the major religious traditions vary widely as to when the soul enters the fetus. And some of the, as it says here, there are some that believe it's like a lot of people do believe that the minute you conceive, the soul is in that fetus. Whereas most cultures, Eastern cultures, believe that it is no sooner than 40 days that it merges with the body. And some believe that it's actually 120 days before it bonds completely with the body. And it's a moot point as far as it doesn't really matter whether we agree on when that ensoulment happens, but just that it does. But my experience in working with women that were pregnant was it was closer to the 120 days before that soul ever entered the fetus. And that then they merged and began to develop together. And when I was working with her, and she was getting months and months on, and it did end very happy. She did bring that child, and then the next child all through the 9 months. But with both of her kids, I did energy work, and when I would be working over the womb, the child would be doing this in the womb. And because the child, the soul, has way more senses than we do, and until we're out of the body. But it was so funny, and I'd be like, do you feel anything? Yeah, he's really moving. And then later, yeah, she's really moving. I'm like, but I could see that she was playing with the light. It was really, or he. So this artist is fascinating, Alex Gray, but he creates these luminous paintings that look at the body from an energetic and physiological being, and that whole concept of the soul and how it enters and exits the body. And then animals and nature spirits. So when I was, from childhood on, I have not just seen people, but I've seen angels, I've seen what I would call demonic figures. I've seen the spirits of trees and of nature and all those things. And again and again at the bedside of hospice patients, I've seen their pets. I've seen their dogs. I've seen their cats. And I've even had the experience of the person acknowledging that they're there. Like this one gentleman, and I'm a little partial to English bulldogs, but the one gentleman, he would constantly address the English bulldog sitting on his bed. And I could see it. And his family just thought that was hysterical that the dog was there. And he would sit there and stroke that dog and always make room. He's just like, when they were making his bed, well, move me over a little bit because he's got to sit there. And but again and again, I'd walk into a person's house and I'd see a cat run down the steps and into the patient's room or something, and I'd be like, oh, did you used to have pets? And they're like, oh yes, my dear. And they would describe the dog or the cat that I'd been seeing, and they were there for them, just like they were there for them physically in life. So just a few quotes. The soul, Gary Zukov, the soul is that part of you that existed before you were born and that will exist after you die. It's the highest, most noble part of yourself that you can reach for. And Deepak Chopra, the soul is the core of your being. It is eternal. It doesn't exist in space or time. It is a field of infinite possibilities, infinite creativity. It's your internal reference point with which you should always be in touch. And Marianne Williamson, for me, it is the truth of who we are. The light, the love which is within us goes by different names, but the truth of us. Michelangelo said that when he got a statue that he would go to the quarry and get a big piece of marble, and that the way he imagined it, God had already created the statue and his job was just to get rid of the excess marble that's what we're like. Inside is the being that God has already created. Some call it the Christ, the Buddha mind, the Shekinah, the light, the soul, and our job is to get rid of this excess, useless fear throughout forms of the world that actually hide the light of the soul. And Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, the soul is a divine part of ourself. It is our divine nature. It is a part of us that is one with God. Everybody has a soul. It is the immortal, eternal part of ourselves. It never dies. It's immortal. It belongs to God. So then, this is just different books and literature that I researched in creating this presentation. And then lastly, I will just share this drawing with you. And one of the patients I worked with who was dying from advanced breast cancer, and she was in her 40s. She had come directly from the hospital in Euclid across to David Simpson Hospice House, and I was working there at the time. And she had severe pain she had a ulcerative breast cancer. And so she did not have any support, and so she came to us and for symptom management and lived the last weeks of her life at Hospice House. And so she was one of those people that had incredible anger at her situation. She had, was in her early 40s. She had just divorced her husband. He had beaten and abused her for years, and she finally got the self-will to get out of that relationship. And it wasn't months after her divorce that she presented with the ulcerative breast cancer, and so she was angry that all that life was stolen from her and all her suffering, and now she was going to get her life together, and now she was suffering from her own body and dying. And so she would punch, she would scratch, she would bite staff. I mean, she was furious. And if they didn't catch her in a solemn mood or whatever, people were afraid to get near her. And one day the nurses asked me, they said, "Would you please go in and spend time with her?" And I was like, I saw what she did to the last nurse. Did she ask for me? And they're like, well, no. And I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't go in there then. I'll be honest, I was a little afraid. And so I was like, okay. I said, well, I'll go to the door, and if she waves me in, I'll go in. But if not, I'm not going in. And so I went to the door, and wouldn't you know, she waved me in. And then she goes like this. And I'm like, oh my God. So I went up to the side of the bed, and she goes. And so I had to lean over her. And I was ready. I'm like, okay, I'm going to get punched. And she just grabbed my tie, pulled me down close, and she goes, I'm angry. And I was like, I know. I said, are you going to hit me? And she said, no, but I want you to listen and know why I'm angry. And so she told me this about her abusive husband and everything. And she goes, and I'm angry with you, I'm angry with everybody, I'm angry with God. And I said, you have every right to be angry at all of us. And I said, and I just want you to know we're here to support you and not judge you, and also not to get hit or bit. And she's just like, I know. She goes, I just get so filled with rage. And I go, well, why don't we work together about that rage? And she's like, well, we can try. So I did energy work with her, and she fell asleep, the whole cycle again. And then she was able to sit up in a chair because her pain was managed well, and her body was able to use the medications effectively instead of fighting it. And we had the most wonderful conversations. And she talked about forgiveness and difficulty with forgiveness and difficulty with reestablishing relationships throughout her marriage. And we made contact with her mom and her siblings, and she started to allow them to come visit, whereas she had been alienated from them for years because of this man. And right before, like in the last couple weeks of her life, she started doing art therapy. And she made a drawing for everybody on the staff that worked with her. And she gifted them with her drawing and with a new name. It's very biblical, this whole sense of being given a new name. And so she gave me this drawing, and I said, what's my name? Because I had heard about everybody else. And she goes, birthday gift. And I said, I'm your birthday gift? And she goes, yes, Stephen, you're my birthday gift. And I go, I don't understand. Everybody else's name kind of made sense. I didn't get birthday gift. And she goes, Stephen, I'm about to be reborn. And she goes, and you helped me get to the place where I could do that in peace. And she goes, in this hand, that's what I see when you're doing your energy work. I see the flow of the many colors of light and the energy that you drag through the energy field. And she goes, you are my birthday gift, and I want to thank you. And then she went on to say, now you get this professionally framed. She goes, I don't want this taped to your refrigerator or pinned to anything. She goes, get this professionally framed, and then everywhere you go, that is to be hung in your office. And if you go up in my office, it's not hung, but it's in the bookcase, propped up. It has been everywhere I've gone. It's been in my home, it's been in my home office, it's here. And she said, and then you're going to start doing talks about the work you do. And I hadn't to that point. And she goes, and when you do, you're going to tell my story each and every time, because I'll always be with you. And she goes, I want you to always know you are gifted, and do not doubt that God is having you do the work you do. She goes, so when you look at this picture, you'll remember me and you'll remember who you are. You are a birthday gift. So I will close with her. Thank you. Thank you.